Tuesday's lecture was about supply, demand, and equilibrium. And we started off by talking about demand, which is the relationship between the price of a good or service and the quantity that consumers are willing to buy. And the law of demand states that everything else being equal, the lower the price of the good or service, the more consumers are willing to purchase it. Or the opposite, if the price goes up, fewer consumers are going to be willing to buy that item, or the same consumer is going to be willing to buy fewer of that item. And so we can display this by use of a demand curve. We start off by putting the quantity on the x-axis, the amount of the good or service that's going to be bought or sold, and the price goes on the y-axis. And the demand curve is, by the law of demand, almost always going to be sloping downward, meaning that, say that, just for example, if we had this quantity was 100 and the price was $5, if the price rose to, say, $8, there would only be 30 that would be bought by consumers. Consumers would only be willing to buy 30 of the item if it was $8, but if the price fell to $5, consumers would be willing to buy 100 of the item. Again, this is movement along the curve as the price changes, everything else being equal. But of course, in economics, not everything is going to remain equal forever. In fact, this demand curve may shift. And there are a number of factors that may shift the demand curve, and as I mentioned in class, it would be a good idea to try to memorize the list of the items that are most likely to shift to demand curve. So the first thing that we talked about that might shift to demand curve is a change in the prices of related goods or services. And the related goods we put into two categories. One would be substitutes and the other would be complements. So let's say this was the demand curve for coffee, and consumers had the ability to buy coffee or tea. And if tea prices fell, that would mean more consumers would be interested in purchasing tea, and so the demand curve for coffee would shift downward. At any given price of coffee, there would be less coffee bought, fewer consumers would be interested in buying coffee at any particular price, if the price of tea had fallen, because they would substitute from coffee toward tea. The other kind of a related good that we talked about, let me just draw this chart again quickly here. So again, we're going to assume this is the demand curve for coffee, and let's say everybody who buys coffee also wants to buy cream. They're going to use them together, so we would consider those complements. If cream prices were to fall, and again, we're going to assume that the consumers are buying these items separately. So if cream prices were to fall, then the cost to the consumer overall of the coffee plus the cream would, of course, go down. And so the demand for coffee, and demand meaning this relationship between the price and the quantity, would go up. So if cream and coffee are complements and the price of cream falls, then the demand for coffee is going to go up. And we would illustrate that by a rightward shift of the demand curve. The other things that might shift the demand curve, one would be a change in income. If it's a normal good, an increase in income is going to increase the demand for that particular item. And a decrease in income, of course, would decrease the demand for that item. And for an inferior good, it would be just the opposite. An inferior good is one where demand actually increases as incomes fall. And we can think about that in terms of, say, it's peanut butter as opposed to steak. So if incomes fall, people might purchase less steak, which would be the normal good, and more peanut butter, which would be the inferior good. The other things that might shift the demand curve include a change in tastes. If people just like a particular item more, or there's a trend or a fad, or some other sort of popularity comes along for something in particular, then the demand curve is going to shift just because of tastes. And then if people get tired of that particular item or fashions change, the demand curve might shift in. The other item that might change, shift the demand curve, would be a change in expectations. This might be a change in expectations about future prices of the item, might be a change in expectations about future income for the consumer. For example, if you think your income's going to go up next year, you might actually borrow money this year to buy whatever goods or services you like. So if the expectation about your future income changes, you might see that your demand curve shifts out or in. If you think you're going to lose your job next year, if you get that news, that expectation might change your spending, might change their demand for any particular item, even if your income hasn't changed yet. And finally, what will shift the demand curve is the change in the number of consumers. So if the population grows either through births or immigration or something else causes the population to grow, the demand curve will shift out, just because the demand curve is the horizontal sum of all the demand curves of each individual consumer. And if for some reason the population were to fall or the number of consumers were to decrease, that demand curve would shift in or shift to the left. So the other major curve we talked about on Tuesday was the supply curve. And the supply curve is the relationship between the quantity that a seller or producer would be willing to supply of a good or item in relationship to the price. And as you might expect, the higher the price of the item, the more producers or sellers are willing to provide or supply of that particular item. And so when we display it on the graph with the supply curve is going to slope up, meaning the higher the price, the more of the item that is going to be supplied. So again, we would put the quantity on the x-axis and the price on the y-axis. And we could draw a supply curve, which I'll generally label S. And for any particular quantity, or actually we usually think of the supply as a function of the price. So for any particular price, let's say $100 for the item, sellers are willing to supply, pick a number, 700, and if the price were to fall down to say 25, there might be only 200 items for sale or produced. Sellers will only be willing to provide or supply 200 of the item at the price of 25, and if the price were to rise to 100, more than or 700 would be what would be available in this this little example. So just like with the demand curve, which can shift. Well, first of all, so this supply curve and movements along the supply curve show how a supply will change, or the quantity supplied will change, given a change in price. And so we think of the movement along the supply curve as the change in the quantity supplied given a change in price, everything else being equal. But as we observed with the demand curve, in the economy, things are not always equal. There are actually things that can shift the supply curve around, one of which is a change in input prices. If input prices fall, and the input is anything that is used to make the good or the service, input prices fall, then for any particular price of the item, suppliers or producers are willing to supply more. And so a fall in input prices would be represented by a shift to the right of the supply curve. And of course, a increase in input prices would mean a shift to the left of the supply curve. So I'll put that in red, since that's not necessarily a happy thought that we're going to be supplying less of the good or service at any particular price. So another thing that might change or shift our supply curve would be the change in the prices of related goods or services. And again, we would be thinking in terms of substitutes and complements. So let's say we're in the business of manufacturing both washing machines and refrigerators. And so let's think about the supply curve for refrigerators. So at any particular price, this is the number of refrigerators that we're willing to produce. But let's say the price of washing machines goes up. Well, the price of washing machine goes up. That means we can make more money making washing machines. So what we might do is we might move some of our productive capacity out of the refrigerator manufacturer and into the washing machine manufacturer, because we want to capture the ability to make more money by the fact that the washing machines have gone up in price. And so we'll cut back on our production of refrigerators. So if the price of washing machines goes up and we're making both, our supply of refrigerators would shift to the left. That for any particular price of refrigerators, we'd be willing to supply less because we've moved our production over into the washing machines. The complementary good, and it's an idea that I have a little bit more difficulty with, but is that if there's two things that we sort of make at the same time, if the change in the price of one of those is going to affect our supply of the other. And so the example that's used in the book, and it's I guess the only example that I have thought of, well, I haven't thought of any, I just read the one in the book, which obviously you can do too, is oil and natural gas. So if we have and of course oil is very difficult to extract from the ground. It can be a very expensive process, but often oil and natural gas are sitting in sort of the same place. So let's think about in terms of our supply of natural gas. So at any particular price of natural gas, this is the amount of quantity of natural gas that we're willing to supply. And let's say then oil prices go up. Well, if the price of oil goes up, we're willing to expend that extra energy or extra money to go out and explore for additional oil because we can make more money if we sell it. And so the price of oil goes up, and we go out and we drill these new oil wells, and we do that very expensive thing of getting that oil out of the ground because, of course, the price of oil has gone up. And at the same time, because they're in the same place, we actually get more natural gas too. And so at any particular price of natural gas, we're willing to supply more of it. So the supply curve of natural gas will shift out if the price of oil goes up. So the change in the price of oil has shifted out the supply curve for natural gas because they're complementary in production. The increase in the price of natural gas, the increase in the price of oil has increased the supply of natural gas. So when they're complementary goods, they're sort of going to move in the same direction. With the substitute goods, as you may recall, the price of the washing machines went up, and so the supply of refrigerators was actually cut back. So with substitutes, they're going to move in the opposite direction when we're talking about the supply curve. The other thing that might change or shift the supply curve would be change in expectations. Again, the big one would be the change in the expectation of future prices. If we think prices are going to go up in the future, we might hold back on supply this year so we can supply more next year when the prices are going to go up. And if we think that prices are going to fall next year, we might increase supply this year to sell the goods as much of them as possible now before the prices drop. And then finally, the number of producers is going to shift the supply curve. The more producers, the farther to the right the supply curve is going to go because the supply curve in the market is just the sum of all the individual supply curves of all the individual suppliers or producers in the market.